Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Mark Robbins, president of the American Academy in Rome, and we are delighted to have you all in our first online presentation of our new director, Professor Aliza Wong. We are delighted to have her, and we welcome those of you who are in Rome watching this, and those of you who are in other points around the globe. This is a wonderful evening. I know I'm looking forward to Aliza's talk. Aliza is the 25th director at the American Academy in Rome, an auspicious number. Aliza is an Italian historian who comes to the Academy from Texas Tech University, where she served as dean, professor, and director of European Studies. Aliza herself studied at Amherst before earning a PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And maybe it was this juxtaposition between Massachusetts and Texas, where she now teaches, that sparked an interest in the West and the imaginary of Westerns. Aliza's research focus is modern Italy and the Mediterranean, with a particular concentration in issues regarding race, national identity, and culture. She is a dedicated educator and has won numerous teaching and research awards, including a Fulbright Award, which she's received twice, and multiple grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Among her books are Race and Nation in Liberal Italy, 1861 to 1911, and Spaghetti Westerns, A Viewer's Guide, which is from 2018. Her ongoing research, and we'll hear her speak about this topic in part tonight, examines the Italian constructions of the American West in the 19th and 20th centuries. And just a brief note, having returned from Rome from the beginning of our new term, I am delighted to see the impact of Aliza already, who's been in Rome since July. There's a wonderful tenor and tone at the Academy and a great group of fellows and residents. So with that, I'd like to welcome Aliza Wong to the podium.
It went forward. Let me go backwards. Okay. The magic of technology. I am not good at it. So the most I can do is really like click the button and hope for the best. So thank you very much, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the American Academy in Rome for having me. I started on August 1st, and a month later, the first fellows arrived. And 3 weeks in, we are now a happy community and a happy family. And I cannot tell you what a joy and a privilege it has been to start the year with you. Just like with the many friendly faces that I see here, because these are the fellows that I help to welcome, we are growing together at the American Academy in Rome, and there is something joyous about growing up together, about learning this place together, and about learning to love this place together. So I want to thank all of the fellows, the residents, the visiting artists and scholars, our donors, our advisors, our friends, who make this place such a unique, special place of creativity, of scholarly activity, of intellectualism, of exchange, but also just of celebration of what makes us human, the arts and the humanities. So thank you very much for having me. So when I asked Mark how I should actually do this presentation, I could do a very scholarly presentation, but you all know me, I'm not a very formal person, right? I like to do things a little bit more informally. I like to get to know people. And I thought that this was a good time for you all to also get to know me. So beyond my scholarly work, I just wanted to kind of take you on my intellectual journey, on how a Chinese American woman, the daughter of immigrants, one who immigrated in 1968, the other immigrated in 1971, who worked $1.25 an hour, graveyard shift, repairing industrial motors, ends up to be the next director of the American Academy in Rome. And I am very proud to be the first woman of color to lead the American Academy in Rome. But it is in many ways the best of what we are as Americans. It is the best of who we are when we dream the American dream. And it is a reminder that we have to keep fighting for what it is to live the American dream, for what it is to be an American, for what it means to live a life of possibility, to have that privilege, and how that privilege is not afforded to everyone. And so our job here at the American Academy in Rome is also to remember all those people and to fight for them. If we can't do it in politics, we will do it in arts, we will do it in architecture, we will do it in history, we will do it in archaeology, we will do it in literature, we will do it in our writing, we will do it in our painting, but we will fight and we will resist, because we all have the duty and the responsibility to remember why we were placed here on this earth and why we were selected to be a part of the American Academy in Rome. Now, I know that most scholars, most serious scholars, when they're asked, how did you come to this project? How did you become, in my case, a modern Italian historian? I'm supposed to give you a story about what was my passion. I've always loved Italy. It's a beautiful place. Who could not fall in love with Rome? And I'm supposed to tell you that story, and unfortunately I can't, right? The reason why I became an Italian historian is because I met a guy. And he happened to be from Milan, and I needed a reason to go to Italy. And I tell that story not because I don't believe in serious scholarship, not because I don't respect the people who've always had a passion, who read their first Greek myth and decided they were going to go into classics, not because I don't respect the person who walked into, I.M. Pei's beautiful pyramidical structure at the Louvre and said, I want to be an architect. Because someone walked into the library, smelled the books, and said, I want to be an archivist. But because, especially to our fellows here, sometimes the paths that come before us aren't the paths that we necessarily choose because of passion. They're because of happenstance. They're because of the people we meet. They're because of the people who sit opposite of us at lunchtime. The people who sneak in to have a little golden deliciousness at afternoon tea, as Preeti told me, right? And we have to be open to that as well. That sometimes our passions, our research, happens because of happy accidents. Happens because of a conversation that you shared with someone that you didn't think you had anything in common with. Or because you happened to meet a guy. So my journey started because I actually began studying Chinese immigration in the United States. I had been told very often that I should study what I knew. And as the daughter of immigrants, I knew my story. I knew the story of my parents. I knew the story of my family. It is not a monolithic story. It is not a story that anyone else shares except for me. We tend to lump people into these large categories and say that that is the Chinese American experience or that is the African American experience without really understanding the individuality and the specificity of what it is that we do. But when I met the person who would become my future husband, I discovered that Italy, that I also assumed was a monolith, that I also assumed, and I always tell this joke to my students, so please forgive me, there's this mythology in the United States that Italy is this monolithic place. It's the old world, right? It's the old country. And when some Italian Americans come here, they're very disappointed to find out we have moved on. Right? There are skyscrapers here, there's the internet here, right? There's Maniskin here, right? Like there's everything here, right? And so they're disappointed because what they expected, and there's this strange thing, right, where we all imagine that all Italian women look like Sofia Loren, and then somehow when they get older end up being like nonne that stir the pasta pot. I don't know where that switch comes in, right? But to come here and to realize that Italy was not what I had imagined it to be. That Italy is also a multicultural place, that is a multi-regional place, that is a multi-identity place. So I began to explore what it meant to be Italian. And I started with asking about Chinese immigration to Italy. And if anybody wants to know about that, I can give you some information on that as well. But I soon discovered, even as I was looking at Chinese immigration to Italy, that the ways in which I was conceiving of identity, the ways in which I was conceiving of difference, was wholly imbued with what I understood about the United States, not about what I understood about Italy. And I decided that I had to start from the beginning. How do Italians imagine difference? How do Italians understand race, identity, ethnicity? And for many Italians, that begins with something called the Southern question. It begins with the questione meridionale. It begins with the accidental unification of Italy when all of a sudden the North discovered that they had also inherited the South. And the 19th century discourse and the 20th century discourse that comes out of that, that still rears its ugly head even today, right? Of, are the Southerners truly Italian, right? And so I started to explore this idea of the questione meridionale. And don't get me wrong, there were a lot of people who embraced it. There were people who my advisor, Stephen Epstein, who's now an endowed professor at the University of Kansas, loved the idea. He himself wrote a book on the word slavery and where it comes from in the ancient and medieval Roman traditions. But I did have some people who doubted me. I had some people who asked, but what do you know about Italy? I had a professor in the United States who told me that I should, and she pointed, study my own skin. And you kind of have to ask yourself, right? If the only thing you're going to study is your own skin, that means that none of us can study medieval priests, because none of us are medieval priests, right? None of us can study the lost voices of women in the early modern period because they weren't recorded, or very few of them were recorded. We can't study the enslaved people upon whose shoulders Rome was built because they didn't necessarily leave that record or because their voices were not recorded. And so we have to ask ourselves, who has the right to tell the story? Who has the right to imagine that narrative? So I was very fortunate, and as a graduate student, I received my first Fulbright. And so I started doing my work here. I divided my time between Milan and Rome. There's always a constant battle in my house about which city is better, Milan or Rome. Rome. And while I was in Milan, I went to the market, right? So I went to the fruttivendolo that somebody had recommended to me. I waited very patiently behind the person who was standing in front of me because there was a gentleman in front of me. I waited very kindly, and the person who was selling the fruits and vegetables turned to me and said, "Tu, signorina, cosa vuoi?" Tu, informal, not lei, formal. And so in my best Italian, I said, "Oh, mi scusi, io pensavo che c'era questo uomo davanti a me. Excuse me, I thought that this gentleman was in front of me." And he already began to change a little bit, still using the tu. "No, il mio amico. Cosa vuoi?" Right? What would you like? So again, in my best Italian, using the formal, right? I would like, a bunch of grapes. I would like this number of tomatoes. I would like an eggplant, right? And he said to me, "Oh, so tu non sei extracomunitaria. You're not outside of the community. You're not an immigrant." Well, of course I'm American. Yes, I am outside of the community, right? But what they truly meant was, you're not Italian. You're not white. So I said, "Sono un extracomunitaria, sono americana." Then everything started to change, right? So then, "Oh, lei signora, lei è americana, ma perché lei è qui in Italia? Perché lei è qui a Milano?" And so in my best Italian, I said to him, "Oh, I'm very fortunate. I actually am here finishing my dissertation. I'm here on fellowship." Then it got super formal, right? "Oh, you're here on fellowship. You're doing a doctorate. What are you studying?" And I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Italian racism." And I got all my fruits and vegetables free that day, right? But it was also a moment in which I realized there are going to be people who resist what we do. There are going to be people, especially, I mean, the artists and the scholars in here. This is the reason why artistic and intellectual freedom is so important. Because there are going to be people who challenge the authenticity of our voice, the right to tell the story, the ability, right, to create our own narrative. Along the way, I also found the most incredible people. The people who opened up the archives for me, who saved my books for me, who sent me things over the internet, who welcomed my book, who wrote to me after I wrote my book, finally someone saw me. And so there are rewards to this as well. But one of the things that I realized is we have to challenge. We have to really begin to understand, what is it to be a scholar? What is it to be an artist? What is it to be an artist and scholar in Italy? What is it to be an American artist and scholar in Italy? What is it to be an artist and scholar of color in Italy? Because also the number of times that I have been mistaken as the badante, the nanny of my friends' kids, has been absolutely, I love the kids, right? Like, don't get me wrong, like, I absolutely love them. But they, like, there was one time I was at my friend's Doriana's house. She had to run down to get something, I don't know what. And she said, my friend Martino's about to come, just let him in. So he knocked on the door, I let him in, right? I didn't know Martino, right? He didn't know me. And so we're just kind of staring. I told him, Doriana è andato giù. She went downstairs to go get something. She'll be right back. And he asked me, like, after a couple awkward silences, because I didn't know the person, right? He finally says to me, signora, do you know where the glasses are? And I'm like, no, this is not my house. But I start opening every drawer, like looking for glasses, right? Like, you know, for water glasses. And I find him a glass, and he says, oh, may I have some water? So I went and looked for some water. I mean, what was I supposed to do? So I poured him some water, I handed it to him, and then Doriana came back and introduced me to Martino as her friend. And Martino turned completely red because he had assumed that I was the housekeeper, right? Part of the reason why I tell this story is because what we also do at the American Academy is to break down those stereotypes of what Americans look like, of who Americans are, and who has the right to claim that identity. Part of our job at the American Academy as fellows, as residents, as visiting artists and fellows, as affiliated fellows, even from the Fondazione Sicilia, right, is to carry back with you the range of identities, the range of possibilities that exists because this place exists. So not only do we have to open ourselves up to the possibility that we might meet someone, we might have a conversation, we might know something different and be inspired by that rhetoric, but also that we need to share our experiences, we need to share our identities, we need to share our abilities and disabilities, and the possibilities that come with that. So fast forward, and after I finished my dissertation, we start applying for jobs. And the guy that I met gets an offer from Texas Tech University. He flies to Lubbock. I ask him, I call him up, I say, first of all, is there a target, right? Because I need to make sure that it's civilization, right? Like, I need a target, right? But then the second thing I ask him is, what's it like? And he says, it's really flat. He's from Milan. He's from the Po Valley. When someone like tells you it's flat, it's like really flat, right? And so we Googled Lubbock. We found out where it was. And we told his parents, right? We told my parents, right? Who they all had to look at a map. Where is Lubbock, Texas? And he told all of his friends, I got a job at Texas Tech University. It's in Lubbock, Texas. None of them knew where it was. They all had to Google, right, where Lubbock, Texas was. For those of you who don't know, it's in West Texas. But my friends from El Paso will tell you, no, it's Northwest Texas because we're West Texas, because it's even further west, right? Monica's nodding at me because she's from Texas. She's like, yeah. So it's in West Texas. The only person who knew where Lubbock, Texas was our friend Michele Marini. And why did he know? Because he was the biggest fan of a comic book cowboy named Tex Willer. Okay, and I will be talking about Tex Willer in just a little bit. And whenever you talk about Tex Willer, every Italian is an expert in Tex Willer. right? Like there's not a non-Italian, like there's not an Italian who read Tex Willer who's not an expert in Tex Willer, right? But apparently Tex also went to Lubbock. Who knew? And that's how we found out where Lubbock, Texas was. Now, in just the same way that I said, right, that sometimes your passions, sometimes your paths, sometimes your research comes from coincidence, comes from chance. In the same way I found myself in Lubbock, Texas. In the same way I found myself at Texas Tech University. In the same place where I found opportunity, where this university trusted someone like me to move up through the ranks, to be an assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, faculty senate president, then associate dean of the honors college, and then interim dean of the honors college, director of European studies, who gave me all these opportunities so that I could potentially lead the American Academy in Rome, a place that nobody knew, gave me the chance to do those things. So sometimes it's not necessarily about the connections you have, but the place you're at, whether they'll give you that opportunity to rise. Now, when I say that, you're inspired by the place you are, and sometimes by happenstance, not all of you have met my son. My son, Luca, and he's probably online, and he's like horribly embarrassed now, because I mention him in every single talk, because he is the apple of my eye and the meaning of my existence, right? He's 20 years old right now, and he's in college. When he was very little, he came home from pre-K at 4 years old, and he asked me, Mommy, well, he actually said hot dog, because he doesn't call me mommy, he calls me hot dog. It's a long story behind that, right? But I thought he would grow out of it. He did not grow out of it, because at 20, he still calls me hot dog. No explanation, right, that I can give you for that, right? So he said, hot dog, what am I? Right? For a biracial child to ask you, what am I? So I tried to explain, as you would to a 4-year-old, well, you're 50% Chinese, because mommy is ethnically Chinese. You're 50% Italian, because daddy is Italian. You're 100% American, because you hold an American passport. But you also are 100% Italian, because you hold an Italian passport. And he looked at me and he said, you can't be 300%. So I asked him, Luca, so what do you think you are? And he looks at me, and we start him young in Texas, right? He looked at me and he said, I'm 100% Texan. So if you have a kid who's 100% Texan, who's also 50% Chinese, 50% Italian, and also 100% Italian and 100% American, you have to ask, what does it mean to be in the US West? What does it mean to be in Texas? What is the story that's told here? And as I began to imagine it, I realized that the American West that I knew, and my argument in my new work, is that the American West that we know is not, in fact, invented by Americans. That if you actually go to Japan, you go to India, you go to Nigeria, you go to Argentina, and you say cowboy, they imagine Clint Eastwood on a horse with a serape, a cigarillo, and they hear in the background, no, 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 right? So how do we imagine this? Where does this come from? And we tend to think that it's because of Sergio Leone and the spaghetti westerns, the westerns all'italiana. But in fact, the love affair with the West does not start in the 1960s with Sergio Leone. In fact, it starts much earlier. Those of you who are Italian will recognize the great hero Sandokan, invented by Emilio Salgari, right? The great children's novelist, right? That basically everybody in Italy read. To this day, they are books that they read. Umberto Eco said that when he was growing up, you had a choice. You were either a Salgariano or you were Verniano, Jules Verne or Emilio Salgari. And he was firmly in the Emilio Salgari camp. When he got older, he was not so sure about Salgari, and he kind of turned towards the Jules Verne camp. I am still firmly Salgariano, right? And partly it's because he invented Sandokan, this Malaysian pirate who was anti-imperialist, who fought for the marginalized and the minoritized, who fought against, as you can tell from the cover of this book, right, against the British imperialists, right, and who inspired a number of different people. In fact, he inspired, Paco Ignacio Tabo, who said, yo soy anti-imperialista porque c'è Sandokan, non per Lenin. Okay, so I am an anti-imperialist because of Sandokan, not because of Lianin. Poor Lianin's turning in his grave because he got displaced by a Malaysian pirate imagined by an Italian writer. But because we are on the Gianicolo, Omar Calabrese actually argues that Sandokan was inspired by Garibaldi, right? And so even then, in the night when Sandokan was invented at the turn of the century, right? Already Italians were using the motif of adventure, of frontier, in this case the East. But he also writes about the West as a way to imagine possibility, as a way to imagine revolution, as a way to imagine anti-imperialism. So in 1909, he publishes Sur la frontière del Far West, not half as popular as Sandokan, but he'd been looking for something else. So this is the original cover from the Sandokan series. This is a 1970s cover from, this is a trilogy, La Scotenatrice, and you can really see the 1970s influence, right, in this cover, and then a cover from the 1990s. But you can also see the stereotyping of Native Americans, of what it meant to be Native American, right? Fast forward to 1910, and we have the audacity of Toscanini, who serves at that time as the director of the Metropolitan Opera in New York, Puccini, the foremost composer of Italian opera, David Belasco, who is actually American, who, for the opening of the Metropolitan Opera, Puccini is invited to debut a new opera. They invite him. They say, we want you to debut a new opera. Now, of all the things that he could have done, right? He'd just written Madama Butterfly, right? He's about to open in New York City. The Metropolitan Opera wants to make its mark as a premier opera house in North America. And what Puccini decides to write is an Italian opera about the American West, La Fanciulla del West. Okay? Now, I want you to think about the audacity of that, right? That at the Metropolitan Opera, Toscanini and Puccini, with Enrico Caruso, right, who plays the lead, as Jack Dawson, and then Emmy Destin, who plays Minnie, the protagonist, that what they are going to do is they are going to teach Americans how to be American, right? And the beauty of this is they also do it in New York City, right? So some of you who have seen these commercials about like old El Paso salsa, right? And so for those of you who don't know, like when we sell Mexican food, there's this one brand, right? And it's very famous because they say that they want Mexican food and the only thing they have is Old El Paso. And when they look at Old El Paso, they say, where is it made? And they say, New York City. And they go, New York City? Yes, so in New York City, they debuted this opera where they were going to tell Americans how to be American, what it meant to be American. It was received with great success for about the first 15 minutes. And then it was criticized heavily, right? And in fact, La Fanciulla del West is not as famous as Turandot or the other Puccini operas, or Madama Butterfly. But if you connect this together, you also, and I should go back a step, part of this all starts with a love affair with Buffalo Bill, okay? So Buffalo Bill does his tour in Europe, and there's a famous story. Now, it's not corroborated, although it appears in several newspapers in Italy. So in the 1890s, Buffalo Bill, after touring England, after touring France, comes to Italy. And he goes to a number of cities. He's very well received. He also comes to Rome. He has a meeting with the Pope, and he's very impressed by the Pope, right? They actually compare, because the Native Americans are forced to dress in stereotypical, right, like feather headdress. They compare the colors of the headdress of the Native Americans to the colors of the Pontifical Guards, right, and compare the brilliance of their costumes, right? But Buffalo Bill is taken to the Colosseum, right, the Colosseo, and told, why don't you stage your Wild West show here? Wouldn't it be an incredible thing for you to stage your Wild West show where the gladiators fought? And the myth is Buffalo Bill walks into the Coliseum, looks around and is like, it's a little small. There are all these holes and bumps and ruts and stones. I can't possibly perform here. So a count, right, one of the Italian aristocrats says, no problem, I'll give you my grounds, and challenges him to basically what is a duel. The Butteri from Maremma, the Italian cowboys, versus the American cowboys. And whoever wrangles the horses the quickest will receive a price of 1,000 lire. Okay, we're all in euros now, so we're like, how much is that, right? So 1,000 lire was a big prize at that time, right? So they go, the American cowboys wrangle the Italian horses. They have a very difficult time of it. And then selected from the Maremma Butteri is Augusto Imperatore, also known as Augustorello, right? And the count, after seeing that Buffalo Bill's wranglers are able to kill the Italian horses, threatens them and says, either you beat these Americans or I will kick you off of my lands. And Augusto Imperialo says, sta buona, right? Like, what are you thinking, right? Like, I'm Augustorello, do you not know who I am? And he proceeds to wrangle the American horses and beats the time of Buffalo Bill's cowboys. Now, the story goes that Buffalo Bill starts to complain. He starts to say, no, the rules were unclear, you all cheated, this isn't right, right? Like, and then steals the 1,000 lire and rides off into the sunset with his prize. Now, again, there's no confirmation of this, right? But in 1933, Mussolini commissions a couple films on the Maremma Butteri. Now, the footage of this isn't the greatest, right? But the title of it is fantastic. Because it's the wranglers of horses and bulls in California, but our Maremma Butteri will not let them beat them, right? Like, they won't leave us behind, right? So this is from Istituto Luce, right? Commissioned by the Fascist Party to talk about the strength and virility and masculinity of the Italian people. And there's a series of these films where they compare the Butteri from Maremma with American cowboys. But then we go back to Tex. Okay, this is Tex Willer, who remains one of the most popular comic book heroes today in Italy. They still sell over 200,000 copies every issue. He came out, the Tex comics came out in 1948. The stories were written by Bonelli, the drawings were written by Gallipini, and supposedly he was modeled after Gary Cooper. Okay, now it's a story as old as time, right? He is a ranger. He falls in love with a Native American woman. Her name is Lilith. She is the daughter of a Native American chief. When he dies, he leaves the Navajo Nation to Tex Willer, who becomes the chief of the Navajos. Very Dances with Wolves kind of style, right? And so with Tex Willer came, again, another representation of the fascination with the American West. And so we have Tex Willer, his pard, Kit Carson, his child with Lilith, because Lilith dies soon afterwards, Kit Willer, and of course, he also has his Native American sidekick, Tiger Jack. Okay, now every time I talk to Italians, right, I'm like, oh, Tex Willer. They're like, no, it's Tex Willer, right? Otherwise, it's not Italian, right? So it's also not Tiger Jack, it's Tiger Jack, right? But he begins to invade the landscape. So just like with Salgari, who introduced the idea of adventure, also of an anti-imperialist, right? We see these heroes. We see these people who are supposed to be the heroes of the downtrodden, the marginalized. Tex Willer is one of the very first to put Native Americans in a different light, to actually begin to talk about the imperialism of the United States and what happened in the genocide of Native Americans. But that doesn't mean that they were also particularly politically correct, because in fact, he relied on some of the most Orientalist motifs that you could possibly find. He called many of the Chinese workers that he found in the West, he used the term muzijali, yellowface. That's my favorite, face di zafferano, saffron face, right? To refer to Asians. For African Americans, for Black people, he often called them carboncino, charcoal, sacco di carbone, sacks of coal. Tex was criticized by both the left and the right, by the Catholic Party and the Communist Party at the same time. But he still lives on in the memory of what is the American West. And for many children, what they know about the American West comes from Tex Willer. So in honor of my friend Herb Golder, who I had dinner with last night, and he gave me this great quote about how you never see cowboys eating spaghetti, right? Despite the fact they're called spaghetti westerns. Tex Willer and Kit Willer and Kit Carson always have exactly the same meal. They have a steak 3 fingers high, a mountain of fried potatoes, golden and crunchy, followed by a pint of beer and coffee, boiling hot and strong, and for dessert, apple pie. But it inspires other cowboys. Who knows what this is? Saskia? Yes, it's Quarto Stato, right? Which is the movement by the peasants, right? It's yes. And so it is a strong labor movement, right? Working class movement, talking about the peasant revolution. It is at the Contemporary Art Museum in Milan. It is the one free piece. You have to pay admission to go into the museum, but you can actually go up the spiral staircase, and it is free, in honor and in recognition of why this painting was made. Ken Parker is another Italian cowboy comic that resonates. So we see again this anti-imperialist rhetoric, right, that is coming through. Again, the US West represents this opportunity to talk about resistance, to talk about revolution. Now, the other thing that I should tell you is that Claudio Perilli, when he talks about Tex Willer, and when he talks about this cowboy, it's not nonviolent, right? So just so you all know, he actually counted, okay? Tex Willer, by the time that Palmieri had counted, had killed 2,410 enemies. Of those, 1,046 were white, 782 were Indian, 436 were Mexicans, 61 were blacks, 36 were Chinese, 17 of Arab descent, I don't know how they ended up in the US West, 10 Malaysians, 8 cavemen, 6 thugs, 4 Kanaks of Melanesia, 1 mummy, 1 sorcerer, 1 zombie, and a gremlin. It's a wonderful research project that I get to do. But to connect this all together, right, we also have to understand that Sergio Leone was inspired and read Salgari and also Tex Willer. So we begin to see the beginning of what we call in Italy the westerns all'italiana, and what we call in the United States the spaghetti westerns. So, per un pugno di dollari, fistful of dollars, for a few dollars more, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And I put the Japanese poster specifically in there because we all know that For a Few Dollars More was actually inspired by Yojimbo, right? And so we have the samurai inspiring the cowboy, inspiring the other traditions. And this is the person. I know that the American Academy honored Ennio Morricone just a few years ago. And of course, Ennio Morricone and Sergio Leone were collaborators. I love this picture because it's Sergio Leone with spaghetti for a beard. And of course, it has to be French, right? But there were many other directors that were in the tradition of the spaghetti westerns, right? So to connect all of this together again, right? If Sergio Leone was a fan of Tex Willer and was a fan of Emilio Salgari, Sergio Solima, also director of spaghetti westerns, right? Along with Damiano Damiani, Sergio Corbucci, a number of other filmmakers. Sergio Solima agrees to film Sandokan, the Malaysian pirate of Salgari, right? After he films all of these spaghetti westerns, right? But only if he is allowed to have someone who is non-white play the lead of Sandokan. And so this is Kabir Bedi from a 1970s teleseries that many people in Italy. So how many Italians are in the room? How many of you watched this film series? There you go, right? And I bet some of you can also sing the theme song if I asked you to, okay? This all inspires another genre, okay? So in the 1960s, television. Well, television arrives a little bit earlier in Italy, but there's very few channels. Like, so my husband and I had this really weird conversation because for a while he kept telling me about, I was asking, what TV did you watch when you were little? And he said, well, there was one channel, it came from Switzerland. It was only on like, you know, for a certain amount of time. Then when finally like they started to bring in more television, it was all public programming. So it all had to be educational. Okay, so my husband and I had this argument because he was like, I was asking him, well, what did you watch? And he said, well, I used to love this cartoon with a dog that was gray. And I said, what dog is gray? He's like, Scooby-Doo? He's like, no, that's brown, right? Like, so it was gray. And I said, the only other dog I knew is blue, Huckleberry Hound. And he said, no, it's definitely gray. So I'm in the middle of a phone call. I'm on a defense, like one of my students is defending their thesis. And he comes in and he whispers, hey, Blue, Huckleberry Hound, hey, Blue. Because he had a black and white TV, because he didn't get a color TV until the 1970s, right? But when television finally comes, there's very little programming for children. So they develop a commercial program called Carosello. And Carosello is not supposed to be commercials, right? It's supposed to still be educational. There's these little pieces that they can do, and only the very last section can you mention the product that you are selling. But it is the only program, it comes in serial form, there are stories that you follow, everybody watches it. How many people watched Carosello? Okay, how many people heard a letto dopo Carosello? Okay, that means, and that's what children did. They ate their dinner, they sat in front of the TV, they watched their 30 minutes of commercials, and then it was off to bed with them, right? Well, Carosello understands that the spaghetti westerns are incredibly popular. They understand the beauty of Salgari, of Tex Willer, of all of these different versions of the American West. So they become inspired. So follow me here. Gets to number 1. 1965, Adriano Celentano. Maybe not.
Colpito a piombo nella schiena lo vidi steso nel deserto che respirava come un morto. Scattò brillando la mia lama e la pallottola levai e la sporca vita gli salvai a quel Ringo.
Huge success in Italy.
L'ho curato finché un giorno
And there is nothing but flattery in imitation.
Giù nel Montana tra mandri e cowboy c'è sempre qualcuno di troppo fra noi. Blackjack da Las Vegas, tornato da poco, ha aperto in paese una casa da gioco e adesso ad andarci a giocare mi accingo.
You see
Vedremo
Clint
chi vince,
Eastwood?
se lui o
Lo sigarillo?
Ringo.
Not Ringo, Gringo.
Sono qui alla roulette che punta sul nero e son 20 volte che viene lo zero. Ci provo coi dadi, mi arrabbio, mi rodo, ma è meglio coi dadi che faccio un bel brodo. Fra poco ragazzi finisco a Remingo, sarebbe Remengo ma è per far rima con Gringo. A un tratto uno sgherro che è sbronzo suonato mi dice ghignando che tutto è truccato. A quanto blackjack gli allento quei gnocchi che a slot machine mi diventano gli occhi. Poi della roulette sulla giostra lo spingo, stavolta esce nero, parola di Gringo. Ormai quel bestione mi pare convinto, raccoglie in un sacco le fiche che gli ho vinto, poi mentre lo porge con l'aria più mesta, lei me lo cala giù sopra la testa, poi scappa, ma il collo stavolta gli allungo, mannaccia la rima con Gringo. Siamo fermi di
Now,
fronte,
this
son
is the
calmo e
point. There's
sereno,
always a
stavolta
showdown.
Jack prendi l'ultimo treno.
But right
Il
when
sole
they're about to
al zenith è giunto
shoot,
da poco. Sarà mezzogiorno,
it becomes high noon.
mezzogiorno di cuoco.
And it's time to
E
make
vedendo
lunch.
la carne montana
So
che
they have to
stringo,
buy
allez,
canned
vengono
meat,
tutti a mangiare
which is
con-
what they are selling in this commercial.
Mangiate montana
Right.
e carne ben scelta, così
Have any of you had carne montana? I don't recommend it, but you know, we're also the Rome Sustainable Food Project, right? So, but all of this love of the American West by Italians has inspired Americans. This is Ron Howard's Solo, a Star Wars story. This is The Duel. Does this scene look familiar to you? Or internationally, what is known as the ramen Western or the sukiyaki Western. I really love the good, the bad, and the weird, right? Or Red Dead Redemption, for those of you who've ever played the video game, based off of the Westerns all'Italiana. Jack White, Danger Mouse, Nora Jones, creates an album completely dedicated to the sounds of the spaghetti Western. Or those of you who are Quentin Tarantino fans, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where in one of the very last scenes, Cliff Booth asks Rick Dalton what's wrong, because Rick Dalton is very, very upset. And Rick Dalton says, when he's been meeting with an agent, he says, he wants to help me get into Italian movies. And he's complaining, he's in tears, he's crying, and Cliff Booth says, well, I don't see what's wrong. From where I'm standing, going to Rome to star in movies does not sound like the fate worse than death that you seem to think it is. And Rick Dalton replies, come on now, you ever seen an Italian film? You ever seen an Italian Western? They're awful. It's an effing farce. And Cliff Booth says, yeah, how many of you have seen one or two? And he goes, I've seen enough. Nobody likes spaghetti Westerns. And yet this is the image that we have of the American West. But I also say to all of you, to all of my fellows, to all of my visiting artists and visiting scholars, to all of my residents, to all of my affiliated fellows, to all of my friends, to all of our donors and colleagues and supporters, I repeat what Cliff Booth is saying. From where I'm standing, going to Rome to star in movies does not seem like that fate worse than death that you seem to imply it is. From here, in Rome, it is not a fate worse than death to be at the American Academy, with the Bass Garden behind, with the library and archives, with the Cortile, with all of these people surrounding you. You have an opportunity. Let happenstance and chance, let coincidence and the encounter change your perspective, change your meaning, and change the direction of where your life will go. Thank you very much. I feel like I'm at the Leonidoro. Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions. And those of you who are on Zoom, you can put the questions in the Q&A. And Lindsay Harris, our high school arts director, is going to pick some of those out. But why don't we take one from the room first, if anybody has a question? Yes.
Talk about blazing saddles.
I think that, I mean, like when you really start to consider the influence of these things, right? You start to also see there is one spaghetti musical that has Rita Pavone in it, right? And it's called, I think it's called like Little Rita nel West, right? There is, I mean, this combination of genres, right? Some people would argue that the spaghetti Western, and Herb and I were talking about this, right, is the ultimate stage, the ultimate rendition, the ultimate reinvention of the Greek tragedy, right? So within that, Greek tragedy is also Greek comedy, right? Like, I mean, like, and so, yes, I mean, like, all of this has been inspired by all of these different things. And the ability to then find also the humor in all of this, right? With what we see in Carosello, with what we see in Gringo. And there's so many other Carosello ones, right? All inspired by this ability to ask ourselves, what are the possibilities in the West? So yes, Blazing Saddles is a fantastic film, right? Also fits into this schemata of how it's actually inspired. So, yeah.
Yes. From Vincent Katz watching online, are there any other operas you know of that use Western themes?
I mean, not that rise to the caliber and rise to the prestige, right, of Puccini, right? I mean, this is really one of those things that we begin to see like really coming up. We see other things that are more kind of on the musical end of it. But in terms of like Italian opera, I mean, like there was a reviewer of La Fanciulla who actually asked, like, what is Puccini thinking? Right, like what does he know about America? Right, like how can he write this? And Puccini like basically dismisses himself. This is not an American opera; it's pure Italian opera. So of that caliber, of that prestige, no, nothing that appears at the Metropolitan that then debuts in Rome, that then debuts in La Scala. Not that I know of. Not that is of that level. Saskia.
I have a question just about the reception of La Fanciulla del West in terms of, you talked about its reception in New York, but how was it received within Italy when it premiered here?
I mean, it's well received in New York at its debut, right? That he receives like 15 minutes of applause, right? And everybody comes. Some of the founders of the American Academy, right, actually go, right? You have all of the industrialists there, right? There are like cars that, like just people bedecked in jewels and fancy clothing, right, that go to the Metropolitan to celebrate the debut of a Puccini opera at the Metropolitan, right? In Italy, it's lukewarmly received. It is much more problematic when it gets up north. We also see a lot of the futurists beginning to protest, and in fact, we see several political protests right outside of the premiere of the opera in the north of Italy. So it's not, there's a reevaluation of La Fanciulla from a musical critical viewpoint, but it is not one of the beloved operas in Italy. Also because, I mean, he did a lot of experimental things, right? He put ragtime in there, he used different kinds of instruments, he used different kinds of rhythms, and this public was not ready in that way for that kind of experimental opera. Yes?
This is my question. Not online. Thank you for this description. I was fascinated by the precursor with this myth of a frontier, and which I think is deeply ensconced in American culture, always kind of moving beyond. And I wondered if there were other instances. You could speak more about frontier myths in the Italian context that maybe don't go towards Western mythology.
I mean, you have Sandokan, right? Malaysia, that is a really, really big influence. And in fact, I would argue that, I mean, for that kind of turn of the century, Sandokan, I mean, in Sandokan Like the West is another personage that really like travels through time. right? And really up until the 1970s, even when they started making Sandokan, and they were going to remake Sandokan. It's still in the works, and they haven't been able to get it into production. Sandokan is another person who is an anti-imperialist, a pirate, who is going out to try to battle the powers that be, right? And so it is staunchly that way, but that's looking eastward, right? It's east and west, right? That motif of kind of east and west and you know, what the possibilities are on those sides. You don't find those same heroes in Europe in the same way. They can't discuss them in the same way. And so they situate it in those places where less is known, where they can use their magic. It is Orientalism, right? Where it's not necessarily about the place that they're at or the knowledge that they hold, but what we hope happened, what we need to have happened, what we want to have happened in order for our metaphors to work, right? So one is the American frontier. There is also, I mean, like Sandokan was embraced by Latin America, right? So Che Guevara is a big fan. So Salgari and Sandokan is actually translated into Spanish and actually moves into Latin America as they are fighting different wars, right? Also kind of anti-imperialist, right? So you have Che Guevara, who's a big fan. You have Carlos Fuentes, who's a big fan. Isabel Allende, who's a big fan, right? And so you have this reach. And again, I think sometimes we think of Italy as this kind of like located place. You can like put a pin in it, right? But when you really think about the genius that is Italy in, perhaps you would call it cultural appropriation, but I call it cultural reinvention, right? The adoption of different motifs and metaphors and tropes and phrases, and the expansion of that to make it touch these other discourses, right, is actually very, very profound if you think about the reach of these different motifs. I would be very happy to take more questions, but how about we do it upstairs while we have an aperitivo, because I have already run over time. You will find out I talk a lot. So thank you so much for joining us. And please, upstairs in the cortile, we will have Prosecco and some snacks. So thank you very much.